Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Spirits come forth. We are looking to contact the other side to see beyond the veil.
Excuse me, Tim. I see that you're in the middle of holding a seance. Is it okay if I join you?
Sure, but you have to be respectful, or they won't come across us from the Summerland.
Okay. So who are you trying to contact? A loved one, a family member, or even your beloved cat, Earl?
Not this time. I recently visited the grave of Charles Fort in the old cemetery outside of Albany. And since our show is on Fortean phenomena tonight, I thought perhaps we could call Charles to join us.
Well, I can see a figure starting to form right behind you. So
really?
Yeah, you must be a pretty good medium after all. Hey, well, we're getting late. The show's starting now, so maybe you should just invite your friend to come along with us back to the KCR studio, and he can join us while we talk to a real representative of Fortean phenomena.
Charles, come with us, come with us, come with us. Good evening, Tim.
Did Charles come with us?
I don't
see him.
You don't think? Well, I think he's here somewhere. I visited. I'm an old Fortean myself, a really old one these days. I was on the board of directors of John Keel's New York Fortean Society.
Oh, that's right.
In fact, in fact, they had meetings in the building next door, which has been a vacant lot for about 8 or 9 years now, and they just started putting up another skyscraper, which I'm not looking forward to because the building that they're putting up will be right outside my window, and it will be consistent pounding and hammering and all of that. But on several occasions, I've gone with my friend, the MIB lady, Claudia Cunningham, who's been on the show several times, and we visited Charles Fort's grave up there outside of Albany, and some pretty strange things have happened there. Now, I don't know whether you can put that all on Charles Fort being buried there, but there had been MIB seen and dogs, and even a floating couple who float over the gravestones at night, dressed in pajamas and carrying lit candles. And that's up on our YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I think if you just type in Charles Fort there in the search bar, you'll be able to see me with Claudia roaming around Charles Fort's. I was going to say mausoleum, but I'm not sure it's a mausoleum. The whole family is buried there. I think there's 9 members of the Fort family buried in the rural cemetery just outside of Albany. But Tim, let us not dilly-dally in the cemetery. We'll get there soon enough, I'm sure. Let us know who our guest is this evening. Why don't you introduce our special guest for tonight?
Right. Well, tonight I'm really happy that we have with us Tobias Weiland. Now, Tobias is a passionate Fortean who started his investigative career as a MUFON field investigator, and following that, he investigated independently prior to becoming the head writer and editor for the Singular Fortean Society. Now, Tobias is a frequent guest on various podcasts and radio shows, now including Exploring the Bizarre, and was featured in the Small Town Monsters documentary, Terror in the Skies, which we had Seth on just a couple of weeks ago about that particular show. Now Tobias, he was on small Terror in the Skies for his work investigating Mothman sightings around Lake Michigan. Now Tobias and his wife Emily have been involved with the Lake Michigan Mothman investigation since its advent in the spring of 2017, and they're currently the only investigators to have conducted on-site investigations combined with witness interviews across multiple states. So, Tobias, thanks for being with us tonight on Exploring the Bizarre.
We have got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tim and Tim.
Well, you're more than welcome. Hey, I have a question, and of course it's a pretty obvious one. How did you get the ball rolling on Charles Fort? Now, when I was a youngster growing up, we had the Weekly Reader Book Club, and one of the books that you could buy for, I think in those days, probably 50 cents, was the Book of the Damned, or maybe it was Low, I don't know, perhaps both of them. How did you get initiated into the occult of Fortean phenomena?
Sure. So, when I was growing up, I would read guys like, Lauren Coleman and John Keel, and they would throw that word Fortean around, and they would talk about Charles Fort, and he seemed to be almost this mythical figure, and that inspired me to seek out some of his writings, and now I own the complete collection, but I was just sort of instantly fascinated by those, and not just the accounts themselves, although I mean they were groundbreaking for their era, but his approach, it was one that we've seen imitated since. It's really almost become sort of the standard paradigm, I think, under which most investigators, at least really really good ones, operate these days. That holistic view of these phenomena. I mean, like he said very famously, one measures a circle beginning anywhere, and I took that to heart, and I still do.
Oh, okay. So now you have a very active website. It just went there before the show started, and I see you've got all the latest news up there, including this one incident where this fellow left a bomb on the sidewalk because he thought that there was going to be an alien invasion. What's the scoop behind that one?
Sure. Well, I mean, honestly, this is a fascinating story for a number of reasons. For anybody who hasn't yet become familiar with this guy's story, so out in Pennsylvania, there's a guy named David Oxenreiter, and he called his not his landlord. It was a hotel manager at a hotel he was staying at. It seems like the kind of hotel that maybe has, extended stays. And anyways, he calls this hotel manager, and, he just lets the guy know, in case you were wondering, I have this bomb that I built, and it's important that I speak to the authorities. And it's almost funny how this sort of went down afterwards. So this hotel manager just sort of demands that he take it outside, and Oxenreiter, he capitulates, and he gathers his bomb up, and he takes it out next to the dumpster, and the police arrive, and they talk to this guy, and he tells them about how some time ago, I think it was 2014, he had an encounter with what he called, extraterrestrials, and said that they had delivered a message that if humanity didn't get our collective act together, they were going to blow up Earth with a nuclear laser beam. And
it's nice to know we have some friends out there.
Yeah, right. They're not judgmental or anything. And so Yeah, it's easy to laugh at this. Honestly, it really is. It's sort of on the far side of the spectrum towards humor.
Fringe. But then Fort was
Right.
known to sometimes yank a leg or two. I mean,
Oh, sure.
yeah. In fact, that's why I knew John Keel, fairly well for years. In fact, he lived kind of in the neighborhood here, and you never quite knew. Sometimes if he wasn't just kind of, like telling a tall tale, just like Charles, Fort would. So I think
Sure.
some people take him extremely serious sometimes, and perhaps he wasn't meaning to be, and that comes through perhaps more in some of the literature that he wrote. I mean, our
Right.
favorite movie that we went to see several times was Killer Clowns from Outer Space. So you can see the direction that we're going in here. But
That's a good one. I actually own that on DVD. So.
oh, it's a great film. Now I'm a big Yankee fan. Peter and I follow the game very closely. He's the gentleman who does our YouTube, Mr. UFO Secret Files, that puts up all the shows and adds a little cartoon there in the beginning of Tim and I. We're followers of the Yankees. We root every day and don't miss a game. In fact, they're going to be in England playing Boston. Now, don't ask me whether in England playing Boston, because that's not where Massachusetts is located, but that's where they'll be this weekend. But you have a story on your website, which is what, the Singular Fortean.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the URL.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You have a story about number 33 from the Yankees from years ago, Jose Canseco, who apparently has done some tweeting. He's not in the category, perhaps, of our beloved president, but he's been putting up some pretty strange messages as well.
He has, and it's hard to know what to make of those. Frankly, it's, by all appearances, it's sort of the last gasp of a fading celebrity. But it's really difficult to tell how much with how much gravitas he really approaches these things. I think it's telling. So for anybody who doesn't know, he's been tweeting about time travel and vampires, and at this point he's actually, through his girlfriend / manager or something, actually selling expeditions to go find Bigfoot. He says he can show you one. That. Yeah, if you pay him like several $1,000s and fly out to Vegas, he'll go and take you. And it's actually interesting. And I wanted to mention this before about Oxenrider too. And you're absolutely right about your John Keels and your Charles Fort's sort of having a sort of tongue in cheek approach to some of this stuff. Like Fort, again, pretty famously.
As long as it's not in Bigfoot's cheek, it's okay.
Right. But Fort sort of famously had that idea of the cosmic trickster. This intelligence that he just sort of used as a way to try to make sense of the nonsensical, which frankly is how a lot of this stuff seems. And so, when we're looking at guys like Oxenrider and Jose Canseco, I think something that we probably don't talk enough about in this field, in this industry, is mental health, and how that applies to these stories. I don't know that Jose Canseco isn't having cocaine fueled freak out breakdown at this point, frankly. I mean, given his history. But I think that we're all very quick to start to, sort of just poke fun at him. Or, like that Oxenrider guy, who knows what his deal is, when, there are probably some pretty important conversations that we could be having about, how we sort of want to approach, potential witnesses, contactees, just anybody of interest, in the paranormal or Fortean subcultures when they start saying stuff like this, frankly, and how much seriousness we really want to apply to it. For instance, I'll just throw out a hypothetical here. I'm not saying this is the case, but I don't know that Oxenrider wasn't in contact with some sort of otherworldly intelligence, and frankly, it's kind of irrelevant. I've spoken to a lot of witnesses, and a lot of them had been through some pretty traumatic experiences, and the fact is, whether or not what they said happened to them was the objective truth that really happened to them, they could use some help either way. There was a study done not too long ago that showed, again, regardless of the veracity of any alien abductees' claims, that shows that people who report alien abduction experiences can often suffer like PTSD-like symptoms. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, it wouldn't hurt them to go talk to a professional either way. I guess that's all I'm saying.
He could come on our show. Either one of those individuals come on our show, and we would let them tell their side of the story and let our listeners decide for themselves. Now, sure. Getting perhaps a little bit more serious and less away from the fringe, I did want to give a shout out and a get well to my dear friend Ted Phillips. I understand he's had heart problems recently, and he's not feeling very, very well. And I do hope that he recovers. He's a delightful person. I've known him for long time, and we've had him on the show several times, and he's had a fascinating career. Of course, one of the big things is he's investigated are the orbs or the mysterious lights at Marley Woods. Now, somebody was telling me that you know something about that.
About lights in where
Marley,
now?
Yeah, Marley Woods.
Not ringing a bell.
No.
Where is that?
Oh. Well, it's ghost lights. Ghost lights. They're in. Is it Tim? Is it in Missouri?
Missouri, yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm familiar with those specifically. Certainly I've run into that phenomenon in other places.
Where are you located? Where's your home base?
My wife and I live in Madison, Wisconsin.
Ah, indeed. Well, are you near where they had they were building, I guess about a decade ago, the UFO landing the strip?
Oh boy, now I know there's one up by Green Bay. That's probably it.
Elmwood? Maybe Elmwood? Does that ring a bell?
It doesn't. That doesn't mean that there isn't, a tiny town in Wisconsin somewhere that I've just never heard of. But yeah, no, I know there's one up by Green Bay. That's where my wife went to college, and it's a pretty popular tourist attraction, honestly, as you can imagine.
Well, have you had your share of cryptids there in Wisconsin?
Oh, sure. Honestly, that's probably what I've spent the most time on over the past couple of years. You mentioned Terror in the Skies earlier.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean that Lake Michigan Mothman investigation has it's taken up it's taken up countless hours at this point. And it's a fascinating case. We really didn't even get to touch on anything but maybe the absolute briefest highlights over the last 20 or 25 minutes of Terror in the Skies there, however much time was devoted to Mothman stuff. But I've got right around 100 sighting reports that I've collected since 2017. And, there's been some concurrent, tenuously associated high strangeness events and things of that nature surrounding this too. One of which was, orbs of glowing light reported in I think it was near Prairie Creek Reservoir in Indiana. So a lot of people think, and I wouldn't blame anybody who saw the documentary for thinking this, that most of the Lake Michigan Mothman phenomenon and most of the sightings and everything were located in Chicago, and that's sort of the place you would want to really examine if you were interested in this. But honestly, that's not what my investigation has shown. I mean, it's really spread out pretty evenly between every state bordering Lake Michigan. We've received reports from it's all over in Illinois, of course. We've got reports from Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana.
Now you're working with Lon Strickland on this.
Yeah, Lon Strickler. We've got a team of Fortean researchers who are kind of working together. Lon and I handle most of the cases, and then of course we have friends and colleagues that we'll consult with, and it's sort of a loose affiliation. But yeah, I mean, he's definitely been, the most active person other than myself. Now, back in 2017, there was a guy named Manuel Navarrete, and he ran, still does as far as I know, the UFO Clearinghouse website, and he'd actually received a pretty good number of cases himself. But and this is something else maybe not everybody realizes. A lot of the guys out doing this, a lot of the investigators, they've got full-time day jobs and families and things, and so he kind of got away from it. He didn't have time to really investigate things up to his own standards or anybody's really, and so he just kind of had to leave it behind in 2017. But he was pretty actively involved as well at least for that first year.
And how many sightings have there been altogether, would you say?
It's right around 100.
Have any of the witnesses actually been named, or have they come forward publicly?
There have been a couple. It's not as popular to do that as it used to be. My personal theory behind that is, I think since the 40s, really. People.
Tobias, let me hold you right there, because
Sure.
We're coming up to our bottom of the hour break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Tobias Weiland and the Michigan Mothman on Exploring the Bizarre. So stay tuned for that.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre. I'm Tim Swartz. Tonight, our guest is Tobias Weiland. And so, Tobias, when did you first get involved with the region Mothman?
So my involvement with this case actually came in the spring of 2017. I saw 3 interesting reports come out of the MUFON database, and they were all in mid-April of that spring, and they all described seemingly 3 separate people's encounters with this large humanoid bat or bird-like creature. So and it was interesting. Of course it was. Usually you're poking around on MUFON, you see a lot of lights in the sky stuff, but monster sightings, not so much. And so it piqued my interest, to say the least, and I wrote an article up for it, and And I honestly didn't expect to hear anything else about it. I just assumed that these would be weird, one-off sightings, and that was going to be the end of it. They'd end up in the shrug file, and I'd just move on. But I mean, that's not what happened, obviously. It wasn't too long before they just started rolling in, and I noticed that they were coming into UFO Clearinghouse, like I mentioned before, and Lon's site, Phantoms and Monsters, and so I was curious, naturally, and so I contacted both of those guys, and I interviewed them both for the site, and at that point there had been a good number of sightings that had already come in. I published interviews with them in June and July of that year. Excuse me. And so, it wasn't too long after that a mutual friend actually introduced me, Allison Jornlin, and she's an investigator out of Milwaukee. And so she had been in contact with him, and she said, "Hey, I know this guy. He's a pretty good investigator, and he's got this website, and you've already talked to him because he interviewed you. Why don't we all work together?" And so I had a platform, obviously, the Singular Fortean Society, and it wasn't too long before I was getting reports of my own, and it just snowballed from there. And one of the most interesting things that I think has come out of this was it really wasn't that long before we were getting historical sightings. We would get sightings that people had been sitting on for years, sometimes decades, and the narrative with those witnesses was pretty consistent. It was usually, I had never heard of anything like this before. I thought nobody but me had ever seen anything like this. And my own family laughed at me when I tried to talk about it with them. So I just never talked about it. For guys like us who are familiar with the Point Pleasant sightings and West Virginia Mothman and stuff, we might be sitting here thinking, well, that's ridiculous. Everybody's heard of Mothman, come on, right? But that's not the case. Most people are not familiar with Keel. Most people are not familiar with Mothman. And if it wasn't for, Google and things going viral on the internet, a lot of these people probably still wouldn't be, honestly. And so, that always got to me. That seemed to indicate to me that whatever we were looking into was something that didn't just sort of spontaneously spring into being in April of 2017. I mean, this was something that people in the Great Lakes region seemingly had been dealing with for decades and decades. I mean, the oldest sighting that we have was actually, and you mentioned this earlier, has anybody come forward and put their name on one of these? Well, this guy did. The oldest sighting we had actually was from a guy named Floyd Hancock, and this was out of Indiana. And his sighting was in 1969, which, it was less than 2 years after the collapse of the Silver Bridge, which, as a lot of people listening probably know, is widely considered to have signaled the end to the Mothman phenomenon. But then I talked to Mr. Hancock, and we've got a winged humanoid sighting 400 miles and less than 2 years later in Indiana. So who knows?
So now these sightings, and including the more recent sightings starting in 2017, are the physical descriptions of these winged cryptids pretty close to the same? Is there like some wide variation, or are people seeing pretty much the same type of creature?
Sure. It really is. I actually went back, and I've done this a couple times since this started. I would go back and I would reread the Mothman prophecies, just to kind of look for similarities, because you have to imagine I'm sort of struggling to get traction here and make sense of this. And so, one of the things I noticed was even in those West Virginia sightings, Keel would talk about, people describing these winged humanoids as bat-like or bird-like. You talk about the glowing eyes, and that's pretty generally how people that we've talked to in 2017 and on have been describing what they've seen. There is some variation, and some of it can be pretty startling, as far as that goes. For instance, like sometimes people will describe the being as, maybe having a leathery or scaly texture to its skin. Mm-hmm. I had a guy in Woodstock who swore that the thing had fur. And I mean, Emily and I went down, like, I met this guy. We met his wife. We were at their house. Like, these were serious people. They didn't, and it took convincing, actually, to get us down there. I mean, we wanted to go. I had to convince them that we weren't going to out them, that I was going to tell people who he was. I can't think of anything that they had to gain from this, and frankly, that's been the story of every witness that I've spoken to. But there has been some variation in the witness descriptions. A lot of that, I think personally, can sort of be chalked up to exactly the level of variation you would expect when asking somebody to describe something that they don't even necessarily have the words for. A lot of people like to use pop culture references. I think they find that very helpful. When you're trying to relate to somebody in possible experience, you kind of use whatever tools you have available. We've had more than a few people sort of compare what they had seen to the monster from Jeepers Creepers, if anybody's familiar with that one. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, generally speaking, we're looking at pretty consistent picture of something that people describe as being, roughly humanoid shaped, anywhere between 6 to 8 feet tall, generally, and then maybe a 10 to 15 foot wingspan. More often than not, people will describe the eyes as the only prominent feature on its face. And that was actually another consistency that I found between these and the older West Virginia accounts too. And Keel even mentioned it in his book, how unusual it was. If people would get a good enough look at this thing, at least seemingly, I don't know. But the details of its features were pretty scant. Like nobody really described its face. They would just all describe these huge, mesmerizing eyes, and we've seen a pretty good amount of that.
It's always interesting, though, that when dealing with a lot of unusual, possibly paranormal based cryptids, the red eyes is featured quite often. I mean, and not just with the winged cryptids. You have like the black shucks, the like the alleged werewolves of Bray Road there in Wisconsin. There's just something about those red eyes that I mean, it's just all across the board.
Oh yeah, I mean you're absolutely right. Even some hairy hominid sightings. I think Momo, the Missouri monster, was supposed to have red eyes, and I don't know what to make of it. It's just sort of one of those synchronicities that you have to take note of. Especially because in most of the cases, it's not necessarily something that I would chalk up to, say like eye shine. You know, because most of the people with whom I've spoken, like they don't have a directed light source. You know, they're not shining a light in this thing's eyes to get it to light up and reflect back at them or anything. And so you have to wonder if, and this is contrary to all, you know, biology as we understand it, but it's almost as though these eyes, you know, are self-illuminated somehow, which doesn't seem great for actually seeing anything, but you know, that's what people are reporting, and it is sort of across the board, like you said, between different potentially paranormal cryptids.
Now, I'm curious, have you had a chance to do any follow-up interviews with these people afterwards? And the reason that I'm asking is that a lot of times, and I found this with my own research in cases like this, not only with these unusual cryptids, but a lot of times, you know, with UFO sightings, that people down the road will start experiencing other types of paranormal phenomena. You know, a poltergeist will move into their house. Some people will actually have a change of personality and become interested in, you know, science or, you know, or extreme mathematics, and some people have even gone as far as to abandoning their families completely and going off on a completely different path in their life.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, we haven't had quite enough time, I think, as far as you know, between when the report was taken and where we are now. You know, I mean, for something specific, and that's an excellent point that you brought up, by the way, because it is absolutely true. These are very, very powerful, life-changing experiences, and they do have a tendency to, you know, just cause people's lives to spiral off into all kinds of interesting directions. But, you know, the only reports that we had that were really old enough, I think, to measure if somebody had that kind of experience after, you know, were only taken in 2017 or later. You know, so for instance, somebody had an experience in the 70s. Well, we still didn't get that report until, you know, 2017. So we would really want to look at the people who were experiencing things in, you know, 2000, in the, you know, the 2000 teens, basically, and follow up with them. I have kept in contact with a good number of these witnesses, and I can honestly say for some of them that, yeah, this definitely wasn't their only paranormal experience. You know, I actually had a guy that, you know, this was another one where I was on site doing this investigation, and after he had his sighting, and this guy was terrified, by the way. I mean, he was sweating buckets. I mean, it wasn't particularly hot outside. He was scared. You know, I was a stranger, obviously, and he was telling me about this, you know, this powerful experience he had, and it had clearly, you know, shaken him to his core. And after we were all done, and, you know, he said that he had experienced some other things, but he wanted to leave those out. Like, he didn't want me to put any of that other stuff into his report, which is why I'm being very sort of vague about this. But you know, it was a series of, I think that what I would best describe sort of as visionary experiences involving what most people would conceive of as sort of the traditional like alien gray. And you know, nothing about this guy struck me as unusual. in his mannerisms. I've spoken to, alien abductee witnesses and similar where, they'll, if they seem really, really manic or scattered or something like that, then, maybe I start thinking that, mental illness is a factor and I go from there and maybe want to recommend that, that they talk to somebody if they haven't, although by no means is that the norm. Most witnesses are just normal people who saw something impossible. But anyway, this guy, he didn't strike me as anything like that. He struck me as a very normal guy who was just terrified by a series of events for which he had no rational explanation. And, I wish I could go back in time and talk to some of the people who have had decades, between their experiences and present day. But I can tell you with a lot of those encounters, the ones that have been going, the ones that had happened quite some time ago, they often did actually spark a series of events that, could span years, if not decades. I mean, there's a guy that I spoke to in Indiana, actually, who had seen this, red-eyed winged being, and he would, it scared the crap out of him. He was just out for a walk one night, and he started to feel like maybe something was watching him, and he got real nervous, and then he saw this thing fly over him, and it fit the sort of general Mothman description with the glowing red eyes and everything. And, he told me ever since then, every once in a while, he still takes his nighttime walks out in the country, but, he'll catch a glimpse of these red eyes out in a field or something somewhere. And it always unnerves him, and he just power walks his way home. So yeah, it isn't necessarily a one and done kind of event. I think it is something that can tend to haunt people for some time.
All right, so now here we are in 2019. Are there still reports coming in?
Yeah.
New reports. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So actually, very interestingly, there was a flap, more of a flutter, really, of yeah, you guys can steal that one if you want, of sightings in Woodstock, Illinois earlier this year. And so I mentioned before, Emily and I, going down and speaking to a witness and meeting his wife and being able to talk to them, after his encounter with a hairy winged being, and this was that guy. And so after his sighting, other people came forward, and this was February 2019. Mm-hmm. Other people came forward. We had another witness say that she saw something very similar. I actually even got, and this was interesting, this is the first sort of tangible evidence of anything that I could hold in my hand if I wanted. There was a guy down in Woodstock there who actually called 911. He saw this thing, whatever the heck it was, and it scared him enough that he called 911. And I have this incident detail report because the McHenry County Sheriff's Office is extremely helpful. I was shocked at how helpful they actually were. But I submitted because he contacted me, said this has happened to him, said he had called the police. I submitted the FOIA request with the McHenry County Sheriff's Office, and they sent me this incident detail report. And it shows, this guy called 911. Sheriff's deputy went out to the scene and he talked to the witness. They didn't end up filing an official report because the sheriff's deputy said he looked around and he couldn't find anything. But the fact remains, in February of 2019 in Woodstock, Illinois, somebody saw something that scared them enough that they called 911. And we have proof it definitely happened. So, wow. Yeah, this stuff is still happening.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we only have about 3 minutes left in our program tonight, Tobias. So I want to give you a chance to have you let our audience know where they can find you online, and if you have any, like say, upcoming events that you
Sure.
Want to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. So you can find me at the Singular Fortean Society. That's singularfortean.com. You can also find us, the Singular Fortean Society, that is, everywhere on social media. So I hope you guys will consider, liking us and following us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, every social media site you can think of. If there's one that we're missing, just let us know and we'll add ourselves to it. As far as upcoming events, I will be in the Haunted for Our Schoolhouse July 20th for the Beyond the Grave Paracon there. I'll be talking about the Lake Michigan Mothman. And then again in September, I've got a handful of events. September 14th, we've got the Milwaukee Paracon. And then September 27th, I will be at the Paranomicon at the Mabel Tainter Theater in Menominee, Wisconsin. That's a big one. Lauren Coleman will be there. Grant Wilson will be there. Carl Pfeiffer, Travis Walton, and myself, all sharing the main stage to give our various presentations. And then the very next day, I will be in Rockford, Illinois, for the Illinois Paranormal Conference down there.
All right, fantastic.
You're more busy. You're more busy than the Mothman, I would say.
Right? I have to travel about as much. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have a big wingspan, too, I understand. But anyway, thank you for being on this evening. We had a great conversation, and this will be up, of course, on the KCOR archives, probably later on this evening. And don't forget to visit and subscribe to our YouTube page, Mr. UFO's Secret Files. And thank you, one and all, Helen, Peter, Carol, and, of course, Tim and Tina, and all our listeners out there in Podland. Real pods. Real pod people. All right. Rock and roll.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.